so much for joining us. My name is Jamie Reynolds, and on behalf of MITX, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Consumer Behavior Will Change Marketing Forever. I'd like to start today's event with a special thanks to Buyology, today's sponsor and presenter. For those of you who are familiar with us here at MITX, you may recall that we do a week-long event experience called Future M. Future M was designed to explore the future of marketing, and we first learned about Buyology and worked with them at last year's conference. Their session was one of the most attended ones, so we thought we'd partner with them again so you could learn more from their insights and learn more about some of their fresh material and research that they've done recently. The topic of today's webinar is very important for us marketers looking to the future, and Buyology is uniquely qualified to present today. They are dedicated to helping structure, interpret, and execute solutions that measure and leverage non-conscious decision-making through the use of their proprietary technology. Now, I know that sounds like a lot of words, but we're about to learn more on that front. But before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. We've reserved the last 20 minutes of the webinar to answer your questions. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see your control panel where you can chat with us as the organizers of the events. So please feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll come back at the end and answer them. In addition, we are going to be asking you some questions. So there will be two types. One, which is a free form, we'll be asking for who you are and make this as interactive as possible, so you can submit those answers on that control panel to the right side of your screen. And then in the middle of today's presentation, our presenter, Gary Singer, will come in and have a poll for you as part of the presentation, so you can enter your response right on the screen. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to our presenter, Gary Singer, CEO and founding partner at Buyology. Let's get started. Gary, over to you.
Thank you, Jamie, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Just a brief introduction of who I am, and I offer this more just so you know where I'm coming from in terms of the perspective that I'll be sharing with you. My background is a consummate marketer. I've been doing this longer than presumably some of you are alive. I started out in advertising, first at the Lou Burnett Company, where I was there for nearly 20 years, and my last job was the head of the worldwide Kraft Foods business. I then moved over to another privately held global ad agency, Darcy. I ran the St. Louis office, and then at that point decided that I wanted to get another perspective and joined McKinsey & Company as a direct-elect partner, and I co-ran the branding practice for the Americas, and then thereafter joined Interbrand as the Global Chief Strategy Officer. And as many of you know, Interbrand is the largest global branding company. And then I decided to be an entrepreneur and started my own consulting firm called Redline Results, and co-founded Buyology along with my partners. And you can see below a list of people that I have served over the years. I'd now like to sort of return the favor and, as Jamie suggested, just have you quickly type into the message section your name, the city you're dialing in from, particularly if it's not the Boston area, and what you do. And Jamie will just quickly give you a sense for who's on the call. So if you could type that in right now, I'd really appreciate it.
Oh, there we go. Thank you, everyone. So it looks like we are joined by Ashley, a marketing manager for healthware software startup. Anne from Boston, working for in marketing technology. Jasmine. Wow, tons of people. Maurice. Most of these folks are in Boston, although it looks like we have Maria from Venezuela joining us as a marketing consultant. Gary, this is a great list of people.
Fantastic. And I guess Venezuela wins the prize for longest distance, so thank you.
For sure.
Thank you, Maria, for joining us. What I'd like to talk to you about today is, we're all talking about marketing. Our perspective is, if marketing is going to be successful, it really needs to disrupt the status quo to get people to do something different to grow. And if you think about that, what that really means is the only way you can grow a business or a brand is to do one of two things, and ideally both. The first thing you'd like to do is you'd like people to like you more. So using a fancy word, affinity for your brand. But after whatever it is you do, be it a traditional ad or a web experience, you're hoping that people will come out of that experience liking your brand more and or liking your competitors less, vulnerability. And in a perfect world, you'd actually have them do both. So just think about the Super Bowl is coming up on February 3rd, and people are spending several $1 million for each 30-second increment. Their intent is that after you see my ad in the Super Bowl, you're going to like my brand a lot less, and you're going to like the competition's brand a lot less. You're going to like me more and like them less, and as a result, you're going to buy me more. So that's kind of a core concept. At Buyology, we now have the technology to measure what really matters. And so 15% of the decision making we make as humans is done at a conscious level, is rational, is thought through, is available to our conscious brain as thought and insight. 85% happens at a non-conscious level. And historically, we've had the ability to measure the 15%, but not the 85%. And thanks to the advances that have been made by medical science and social sciences, we now have really cool tools and accurate tools that let us start measuring a good portion of the 85. And so if you just think about it, now that we can measure where the majority of these decisions are made, we can start seeing things that we couldn't see before. And that 85% includes things like memories and values. So each of us has a different set of experiences, and those experiences act as a lens for our day-to-day activities. So my background and Jamie's background are presumably different. We could experience exactly the same thing, and we'll have a slightly different interpretation of what we experience based on those memories and values. There's a lot of talk about the non-conscious in terms of emotion and desires. Intuition and instinct. Instinct is pre-programmed into us as human beings, a response. So if we were all physically together and I threw a snake at the audience, you would all jump. You don't have any choice. That's built in. It's pre-programmed. Intuition is learned instinct. Is over time you gained life experiences, and that life experience becomes your intuition. As I said earlier, I've been a marketer for a very long time. The chief benefit of that is I've built up some pretty strong intuition in terms of marketing because I've seen patterns before, etc. And then habits and customs are just exactly that, is that we've all developed our own little set of habits, that's behavior, and customs is attitudes of what's going on. And you take all that together, and that's what we're calling the non-conscious. One thing that I didn't know about when I started this journey about sort of looking at the non-conscious in a more quantitative way was that what we've learned over the last 4.5 years through the execution of literally hundreds of tests around the globe is when you start measuring the non-conscious, you start making differences much more pronounced. And so literally what's going on here is these tools are allowing us to reveal things that we couldn't see before. And the bad metaphor that I've been using, and if anybody out there has a better one, feel free to type it into Jamie, is if you're walking down the street and you happen to notice an anthill on the sidewalk, from your vantage point, basically what you see is a dark spot. And then if you were to lean down and grab a magnifying glass, you start seeing very distinct ants doing very distinct activity, and not every ant is the same. It's literally that kneeling down with the magnifying glass that we've seen using non-conscious tools. And what I'm really talking about here is we measure identical things both consciously and non-consciously, and when we measure those non-consciously, we start seeing profound differences. this is real data and an example of what I was just talking about. So working with a client, we tested their target audience's preference for 10 different new product ideas. And the gray line at the top is using traditional tools, the tools that this client has been using for years and years to evaluate new products, the overall preference score indexed for concepts 1 through 10. And it's pretty obvious that if you look at the gray line, the differences between concept 1 and concept 7 are virtually indistinguishable. So there really wasn't any discrimination between any of those concepts that was meaningful. And so if you were trying to decide, I've got 10 ideas and I only want to launch one in the marketplace, which one would I launch? Basically what I would say is, based on traditional data, as long as you launched 1 through 7, you're in pretty good shape. And even the least preferred concept, number 10, was not that much different. It was, roughly a 25% change versus the top one. The green line, on the other hand, is the identical concepts tested with the identical people at the same exact time, but this time, instead of measuring preference using traditional Likert scales on a scale from 0 to 10, where 10 is you love it and 0 is you hate it, what do you think of each of these concepts? We measured it using our response time technology, which I'll describe in a minute. And look at the difference. So concept 1 and concept 2 were both strong, although there's a pretty significant difference between the two of them. And then there's almost a 50% drop in overall preference when you get to concept 3. And it continues to decline pretty precipitously all the way down to 10. And frankly, from concept 7 on, there's actually negative preference. People dislike the idea. And so if you're using this as a tool to decide what you want to launch in the marketplace, essentially, instead of saying 1 through 7 is virtually the same, this is saying that 1 and 2 are viable and everything else is significantly less viable. So hopefully you walk away from this chart with the point that differences get pretty interesting. The technology we use is based on a science that's been around for in excess of 25 years. It's the basis for pretty much everything that's going on in the social sciences, particularly social psychology. And if any of you have been following behavioral economics, virtually most of the data that is supporting the key findings of behavioral economics are using response time. And the theory is simple, and if you look at the left hand of your screen, is if I ask you to make a choice, and in this case the choice is between chocolate and coffee, and the question is, which one do you like better, chocolate or coffee? The quicker you make the response, measured in milliseconds, the more deeply that preference is held. So in my case, if you ask me which do you prefer, chocolate or coffee, it's a no-brainer for me because I adore chocolate, and I'm one of the 6 people on the face of the planet who doesn't like coffee. I don't drink it. I don't like the smell. I don't like the taste. And so when my brain has to process this, it's a real quick decision, instantaneous, because I'm being asked to choose between something I love and something I don't particularly like. For my wife, who loves them both, it's a tougher choice because now I'm asking her to choose between 2 things that she feels very positive about. And so there will be a time delay, again measured in milliseconds, when she answers this question because it's a tougher answer for her to generate. And if there's anybody out there who hates both chocolate and coffee, they actually have the same dilemma that my wife has, because now they're being asked to choose between 2 things that they have negative a preference for, and that will be delayed. And so what our tool does is it presents people with lots and lots of questions on the web, and it measures in precise time not only the choice you make, but the time it takes you to make that choice. And then our algorithm aggregates that and comes up with non-conscious measurements for each of the dimensions that we're measuring. There's a little animation here that I don't know if it didn't work. So anyway, I think that sort of gives you a flavor for the technology. I wanted to take you through three kind of ways we've used that technology. The first is measuring what matters. The second is how do you build strong relationships. And the final one is how do you measure whether something you're doing actually has impact, actually affects people's behavior. So on the first one, we're really interested in this notion of cool. We believe that cool is one of those magical words in the English language that really actually taps into the non-conscious. So it's a cognitive word that taps into the non-conscious. It's by definition a measure of favorability. So if you think about the definition of cool, when something is cool in popular culture, that means that its star is rising, that it is ascending in strength. And if something is no longer cool or not cool, that means its star is falling. It's descending in terms of popularity and favorability. And so the reason we're really interested in cool is we think it's a very interesting way to actually predict whether your brand or your business is increasing in is it on the ascent or is it on the descent? So right now, there was a piece yesterday, I believe it was in the New York Times, that Apple stock is declining. People are anticipating because the iPhone 5 isn't selling as well as they thought it would, that maybe Apple is finally on its way down. And so if we could measure today the coolness of Apple from a consumer perspective, we could definitively answer, is Apple declining or is Apple still increasing? Interestingly, when we think about cool, we tend to think about young and hip. Our research says that cool is relevant and important to all age groups, whether you're older like I am or whether you're younger, like I'm sure most of you are. So the importance of cool doesn't change. What is cool changes. And so depending on the group, something that might be very cool for one group might not be cool for another. We actually not only can measure the degree that something is cool, but what are the characteristics of that cool to understand what it would take to be more cool. Cool can't be measured consciously, although a lot of people try, and I'll show you later an example where people did measure cool consciously. But how do you assess cool on if I say rate Jamie's coolness on a scale from 0 to 10, that's turning a non-conscious concept into a cognitive concept. Another word like cool that might make it easier for you to understand is trust. Trust is another one of those non-conscious concepts. And so if I ask you, do you trust Bank of America more than you trust Citibank, and I ask that consciously, I'll get a very different response than if I ask it non-consciously. So the advances in technology that allow us now to measure things non-consciously really allows us to measure something as important as cool. So we recently, this past August, went out and measured a bunch of categories, but the one I'm going to talk about is beer. And we talked to over 500 people, men and women, and we presented them with 9 beers. And in a minute, I'm going to pop up 6 of these, and we measured non-consciously which of these beers is the coolest. So I'd like, Jamie, if you wouldn't mind, sticking up the poll and asking you, from your perspective, what do you think that Americans think are the coolest beer brands? Vote for one.
You all should see the poll on your screen now, and all you have to do to vote is click one of the square boxes next to your choice. So which beer brand do you think is the coolest? We'll give you a minute to answer. All right, looks like we have 71% of you voted. A few more seconds for last-minute choices. And it looks like we have a winner. By far, Actually, not by far. Sam Adams with 45% of your vote, and followed closely by Corona with 41%. Bud Light came in third with 27%, and Heineken and Guinness are tied for the very end with 5% each. Gary, what do you think of these results?
Wow. Well, they're a little skewed because many of you are in Boston.
Very true.
Now, remember that. So you said Sam Adams was 45 and Corona was 41. The results we got were, and this is a national sample against men and women, is by far the coolest beer brand is Corona, indexing at 100. The number 2 beer was Heineken, which was at the bottom of this group's guess. And Sam Adams was number 4. And the other one that you guys guessed at was Bud Light, and that actually was pretty damn uncool. It was the third from the last, and its coolness rating was actually negative. So interesting. Part of the differences is that you guys answered consciously, and the respondents answered non-consciously. But one of the hypotheses we were testing when we did this study was we wanted to figure out if you could buy cool. And so in particular, Bud Light spends hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising, explicitly trying to make itself cool. And our conclusion from the study is that maybe not. Corona is spending a whole lot less money and is a whole lot more cool than Bud Light is. I said earlier that beyond just saying absolute levels of cool, there are characteristics of cool. And what we did is, believe it or not, there are social scientists out there who are studying cool. And we looked at all the research that's been done, and we found 10 characteristics that we think are common to people's measurement of cool. And you can see those on your screen, but they include things like authentic, attractive, surprising, unique, etc. So let's take the top 2 beers in terms of coolness and look not only how they did overall, but what was driving their respective coolness. And so between Corona and Heineken, the number 1 attribute for each of them was attractive. So both of them were seen as being associated with attractive, whether that means attractive people or attractive opportunities. But then you look down at the profiles and they start being very different across the 2 brands. So Corona, number 2, was authentic and then creative, whereas Heineken was inspiring and unique. So now you're starting to see an example of not only can we measure the amplitude of coolness, but we can actually look at what's driving it and where are the differences. And this last chart on coolness is actually comparing young men and young women on Heineken. So for young men who rated Heineken cool, they found it attractive and unique, whereas for young women, they found it also attractive, but authentic was much more important to women than it was to men. In fact, it wasn't even on the top list of men. So again, you're starting to understand what's driving these relative ratings of cool. I could go on and on and on about cool. We've actually done it for other categories like technology brands, but I just wanted to give you a sense for here's something that can be measured that previously couldn't be measured that has incredible utility. Now I want to talk about relationships. So I've spent my whole life advising people on how to create or enhance brands. And one of the challenges in the discussion about brands is no 2 people can agree as to what the definition of brand is. So I'm going to offer you the Buyology definition, which is, in our view, brand is a relationship. It's a relationship between the brand itself and its current and prospective users and all other constituencies. And why is that relationship important? Because it really provides context. And so my context is if you have a pre-existing relationship with a brand that is very positive, then everything that brand does and says is going to be amplified through your eyes because you already feel positively about the brand. And similarly, if you have a very negative view of your brand, of a brand, then everything that that brand does and says will be diminished. And most brands don't have particularly strong positive or negative relationships. And so in their case, whatever the brand does and says is neither amplified or distracted. So I'll use the example of AT&T versus Verizon Wireless. Just let's say, for the purposes of illustration, that you love Verizon and you hate AT&T, or it could be the other way. And so let's say you call up the two carriers and you have the identical experience. And let's say you're pricing out a plan to decide who you want to engage as your wireless provider. And just for the sake of the experiment, we've scripted it word for word so that you have exactly the same experience when you call up AT&T and when you call Verizon. But in my case, I said as a going in, you love Verizon and you hate AT&T. Your takeaway of that experience is actually going to be very different based on that pre-existing relationship. So if you buy this definition of brand as a relationship, it actually is one of the most efficient things you can do to enhance both the utility and the efficiency of everything you do to market and create a business. And so it becomes this giant amplifier. And so as a brand steward or a brand owner, you'd want to make that relationship as strong as you possibly can. So that leads you to the question of how do I make a strong brand relationship? And to answer that, one of my partners came up with what I view as a remarkable sort of metaphor. And so his thinking was, if a brand is a relationship, and the stronger the relationship, the better everything is, let me think of somebody, of a brand in quotes, that has done an exceptionally strong job of building the relationships. And his answer was world religions. That regardless of the religion of your choice, if you are somebody who is deeply engaged in a religion, we call these people believers, and therefore it's an important part of your life, that's an incredibly powerful relationship that guides a lot of the decisions you make on a day-to-day basis. So to test this metaphor, to see if it was actually valid, that the relationships people have with brands have some bearing to the relationship that devout believers have with their religion, we actually conducted an experiment. This was done at Oxford University in the UK, and it was done with respondents who were pre-selected to be devout Catholics. And we knew that based on two things. One is we asked them, do you consider yourself a devout Catholic? And the second thing is we asked them behaviorally, do you go to church at least twice a week? And so we recruited, I think it was a couple of dozen of these devout Catholics. We brought them to Oxford University, and one at a time, we put them in an MRI machine, the same machine that if any of you have been unfortunate enough to have had some kind of ailment, that medical science uses. These are these big hunkin' electromagnetic devices. We put them in the device. We scanned their brain, and they were wearing goggles while we were scanning their brain, and the goggles allowed us to project certain images. And basically what we measure is the activation in the brain in response to each of the images. So the first set of images were Christian iconography, things like crosses and nuns and churches and stained glass windows, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea was that given that these people were predetermined to be people who cared deeply about Christianity, let's use this as the baseline to see how their brain responds to these stimuli. The second set of stimuli was brands that we knew each individual had a really strong relationship with. So brands like Apple and Harley-Davidson and Guinness Beer, and that's Porsche. And then the final set of stimuli was brands that the respondents had weak relationships with. So at the time, this is about 4 years ago, brands that they weren't so hot on were AT&T, BP, this was shortly after the spill, KFC, and Microsoft, which, and I know I'll offend somebody, is a brand many people love to hate. And so what we really did is we compared the respondents' reaction to each set of stimuli. What we were using as the dependent variable is a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. And what takes place in the nucleus accumbens is craving. So back to my chocolate example, if you showed me a bar of dark chocolate, my nucleus accumbens would light up like a Christmas tree. And so we basically were showing people each of these images and seeing whether the nucleus accumbens activated or not. And surprisingly, or not, because it supported our going-in hypothesis, the activation of the nucleus accumbens was identical among these respondents when we showed them the Christian iconography versus when we showed them the strong brands. So that confirmed our going-in hypothesis that they actually do respond to brands very similarly to they respond to religion. On the other hand, there was virtually no activation between when we showed them the weak brands, the brands that they didn't love. So we came away from that study basically saying, yeah, there is some interesting validity here that we can learn from religion and the great religions of the world about how do you build strong relationships. So believe it or not, the next part of our journey was we spent over 2.5 years both reviewing the literature, the religious literature about what are the tools and techniques that religion uses to build followership. And we also actually interviewed religious leaders all over the world with an eye towards, so what's your secret? What are the things you're doing to build these amazing relationships that maybe marketers could also do to build strong relationships? And out of that, we came up with what we call the 10 brand relationship drivers. And if you look at these from the context of religion, they start making sense. So how do brands build really strong relationships? Well, one thing they do is they tell really cool stories. So the religion analog here is this little thing called the Bible or the Quran, which is really a collection of stories, pretty interesting stories, that bind people together and to their religion. And so the question is as you think about your brand, do you have a series of stories that really make your brand connect to their users? And I'm not talking just about the stories you tell. So whether it's the narrative you tell on your landing page, on your website, or in a display ad, but actually the stories that surround your brand. So really strong brands have really strong stories. Another component that religions use that brands could learn from is power from the enemy. Actually, if you consider world history, this has been a tool that has been used throughout the ages and pretty much explains virtually every war that's ever taken place. And the idea here is one way to align people is to align them against another set of people. So if you remember from your history books this little thing called the Inquisition, basically Christian world was united by basically kicking everybody else out. This summer my family vacationed in Spain, and what I didn't know before I got there was up till 1492, Spain was essentially two independent Christian nations, Catalonia, which is where Barcelona is, and Madrid and the rest of Spain. And Isabella and Ferdinand decided that they wanted to unite Christian Spain. And so the way they did that is they basically kicked everybody out. So everybody who wasn't Christian and was the enemy and was thrown out. And that's how they got two disparate parts of geography to come together, because there was a common enemy. And the enemy doesn't have to just be another brand or another person. It could be a cause. So the illustration here is the old PC Mac advertising, where Mac really established itself by creating this enemy, this playful, fun enemy of PC. But another enemy could be a cause like gun control. So that could be a common enemy that pulls people together. Or a less controversial one could be weight loss. So if you're Weight Watchers, you could declare that the enemy is circular diets, where people, the vast majority of us, if we are able to lose weight, eventually gain it back. So how, as a brand, can you leverage power from the enemy in order to build the relationships with your users? And I won't go through all 10 of these, but I'll go through one or two more and then entertain questions about the rest of them. Mystery is one of my favorites. Those of you on the call who have been trained as marketers, we've been told to sort of take all the mystery out. You know, tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. You know, when I was growing up in the advertising world, it was, you know, commonly practiced, don't leave anything to chance, spell it all out. Well, spelling it all out is not terribly effective. A little bit of mystery engages people, makes them participate in the brand, and actually creates some real magic and attachment. This is a little bit of a dated example, but those of you who have seen the movie Inception, you might remember that early in the movie you're given the clue that when you spin the top, if it continues to spin beyond what would happen naturally with gravity, it means one thing. And if the top falls naturally due to gravity, it means another thing. The last scene in the movie is Leo DiCaprio spinning the top. And before the movie, and before you can tell whether that top spins or falls, the movie ends. And I think that's brilliant. Because frankly, if you think about it, and some of you may want to go back and rewatch the movie, if that top falls, the entire movie means one thing, and if the top doesn't fall, the entire movie means something else. And I was so intrigued with this, I actually rewatched the movie to try to see if there were other clues. That's mystery. That makes it much more engaging than it might have otherwise. And so I'll pick one more. Grandeur is being part of something much bigger than you are. So about a year and a half ago, I visited Rome for the first time, and I went to the Sistine Chapel and to St. Peter's. And even though that's not necessarily my religion, you walk into the front entrance of St. Peter's Basilica, and you know there's something magical going on. And whether that magic was created by God or by amazing people almost doesn't matter. It's just you feel mystical. I get that same feeling when I walk into the Glass Cube on 59th Street Apple store. Does your brand give people that sense of grandeur? Does it give them that sense of being in a place that's much bigger than they are? So I could go on, and I'm happy to talk about the others during the question period. But what we're able to do is actually measure the performance of your brand and a competitive set against these brand relationship drivers. And more importantly, to identify which drivers offer you the biggest opportunity to enhance your brand relationship, and then to prescribe what you should do about those drivers to actually increase the strength of your brand. This is real data. It's about 2 years old, where we measured in 4 continents. This happens to be the US, but we also did China, UK, and Japan. The performance of a bunch of tech brands on these brand relationship drivers. This is measuring it consciously. And just to beat the point one last time, that you see things very differently when you do conscious versus non-conscious. At the time, what you see here is, one, the distribution of these brands isn't all that big. So Apple is at the top, and LG, which is at the bottom for the most part. The spread is 3 points on a 10-point scale, which is significant but isn't awesome. The second thing you see is that when you measure this consciously, there seems to be a brand halo. So Apple is stronger on every single brand relationship driver than is Google, which is the red line, number 2. And Apple and Google sort of travel together. So in fact, most of the brands sort of travel together. So it seems to be sort of a category effect. Now you're looking at the same data measured non-consciously. And you start to see some things. First of all, the dispersion between Apple and Google at the top and Samsung at the bottom is much, much more pronounced. So you're starting to see real differences between the stronger brands and the weaker brands. By the way, we've done this more recently, and Samsung is much stronger now than it was back then. Secondly, look at Apple and Google. Whereas before, Apple was stronger than Google on everything, now you start seeing some crosses. So yeah, Apple's a pretty strong brand, as is Google, but while Apple does much better on symbols than Google, Google does better on sense of belonging than does Apple. And so you start to see some discrimination. So back to the idea of cool. One of these brands, let's just for the sake of argument say Microsoft, measures a bunch of attributes consciously in order to assess the health of its brand and of its franchise. And among the attributes that it measures is the attribute cool. Is this a cool brand? And when they measure that consciously, what they find is that their brand is a whole lot less cool than Apple and Google up there at the top. And in fact, Apple and Google are real cool, and they're equally cool. And so, but we're strong on other things. We're strong on easy to do business with, gives you a competitive edge, which are those green spikes sort of towards the back. But we're not a very cool brand. And so then let's just say for the sake of argument that Microsoft then correlates all of these attributes with conscious brand preference. And basically this is a typical tool that market researchers do that says, what are the attributes that are most important that are driving my overall preference? And so let's say Microsoft did that, and what they found was that the correlation of cool was really low. And so of all these attributes, cool was the least important in terms of driving brand favorability. And so you might conclude, if you were living in Redmond, that we're not cool, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in terms of people's purchase decisions. It doesn't matter in terms of people's brand choice. In fact, I'm not even sure why those people in the Valley are spending so much time trying to be so cool, because it doesn't matter. So that's really the situation. We changed one variable. So instead of correlating cool with conscious brand preference, we correlated cool with non-conscious brand preference, measured using the latency response tool. And something startling happened. Cool went from being the least important attribute to being the most important attribute. So the single most important thing that's driving people's preference for one brand versus another in these technologies brands was how cool was the brand, followed by a value for the money and gives you a competitive edge. The exact opposite finding from doing this more traditionally. And so now the conclusion might be in Redmond, cool actually is incredibly important. It's a real problem that Microsoft isn't seen as cool as some of its competitors. And then the million-dollar question is, so what do we do? Now that you convinced us we want to be cool, what do we do? Do we throw out the pocket squares? What we then did is correlated our brand relationship drivers measured non-consciously to cool. And what we found was that vision and grandeur were the two, in this particular instance, were the two brand relationship drivers that are most responsible for creating cool. And then we could work with somebody like Microsoft and say, okay, on vision, what are you currently doing that's driving a vision, and what could you be doing that's driving a vision? And literally by doing that and being prescriptive can help them enhance their level of coolness. I'm going to move on and then open it up for questions. Actually, I think I'm going to pause and open it up for questions to make sure we have time for questions. So, Jamie, have you gotten any questions?
Yes, we have quite a few actually. So the first one is a few requests to receive copies of the deck. And just to quickly answer that one myself, we are recording today's event, so we will be sharing that with everyone afterwards. Gary, I have a really good one here for you around the measurement of cool. Does cool drive purchasing decisions, and if so, how?
Great question. Our work suggests that it does drive purchase decisions, and that it is very responsible for, it's a very important motivator. And let me give you one example. And again, the hard part about a webinar versus when I did this in person is I can't tell when I'm offending you with my brand examples, so forgive me in advance for that. But I'm presenting to you on a MacBook Air. And if you can't tell by now, I'm kind of an Apple freak. And I spent, at minimum, a 30% premium for this MacBook. And my chief technology officer, who is in the office next door, keeps telling me what an idiot I am, that in terms of functionality, I could have gotten, as or more powerful computer for a lot less money if I wasn't so wrapped up in this Apple thing. But a key reason why I feel so good about my MacBook Air, and I love the computer and it functions really well and it does what I want to do, but it's just so friggin' cool. How'd they make this thing this thin? And it's slick looking and it's fun and I feel good when I'm using it and people see me using it. And I would argue that that coolness is what drove my willingness to pay that premium, and also drives my interest every time Apple introduces another product that gets my interest. I'm also sitting on my desk here is my third iPad. It's the new Retina display. I just think it's cool, and I somehow use that as a rationale to spend $800 and buy another iPad, which my kid loves because it trickles down. So I think the answer is that cool does matter, and it does drive purchase decision. The problem has been historically we couldn't measure it, or we were measuring it incorrectly, and so in trying to manage coolness, we really couldn't be terribly disciplined about it. We had to be more instinctual.
Great. We have a request to repeat the question, not the answer, since that was such a very insightful one, Gary, but the question that Gary was just answering was, does cool drive purchase decisions, and if so, how? So thank you, Gary, for answering that one. Our next question is also around measurement, but the question is, what can a marketer who doesn't have access to cool technology that measures nucleus accumbens, is that the pronunciation, Gary?
Nucleus accumbens.
Accumbens, there we go. So what can a marketer who doesn't have access to technology that measures things like that do to measure cool at an unconscious level?
Well, that's why we're using response time. Response time is incredibly efficient. Because it's a web-based tool, it's relatively inexpensive, and frankly, it's more accurate. So while we have a lot of experience with things like fMRI and even EEG and biometrics, and there are some competitors who are very effectively using those tools, we felt that sample size and access warranted a web-based tool. And so the beauty of latency response is you can measure cool. All that cool results that I showed you was done with the web-based tool. So 500 people logged on to our site, saw a bunch of beer brands, and basically answered the question, which one do you think is cool?
Great. So you have a couple of more great questions that just came in. The next one is, do you think that the concept of cool could apply to personal branding, and if so, how?
That's a really interesting question. So the question was, does the concept of cool apply to personal branding? As most of you know, personal branding is a really hot topic right now, which, as best I can tell, it says, take all that learning. It's kind of like if we started with religion is a great metaphor to brands, people are now saying commercial brands are a great metaphor to personal brands. So is cool part of a personal brand? Absolutely. Go back to your high school stereotypic dramas. There were the cool kids, there were the wannabe cool kids, and then there were the nerds. And a big part of the brand, of your personal brand back in high school, and some of us remember high school fondly and others of us not so, is, and I bet there's a high correlation with that in your perception of whether you were at the cool table or the not so cool table, is you were a cool kid or you're a not cool kid. Now you're a cool adult or a not cool adult. Look within an industry, within technology, some of the founders of technology are seen as extremely cool, and others are seen as less cool. So I do think it's a really powerful part of personal branding as well as commercial branding. In both cases, the challenge is how do you uniquely define your aspect of being cool, and what do you do to deliver that? And so if you think about the two coolest people you know or don't know but want to know, and compare them, their degrees of coolness will be quite different from each other. So I think Ben Affleck is really cool. But I think he's cool because he seems to be really intelligent. He seems to be a really good guy, and I thought Argo was an amazing movie. That's a different degree of cool than I also think in his way Steve Jobs was really cool, but in a completely different way.
That makes sense. We have a bunch of questions that just come in, so it looks like we are going to run out of time to answer them all, but I particularly like this next one because we often receive a similar question for all of our events here at MITX. So one of our attendees says he completely understands why cool is important in the technology world as well as in consumer goods, but do you believe coolness is just as important and can be achieved in sectors such as financial services or healthcare?
I love that question. I'm a FIG guy, so FIG is McKinsey Talk for Financial Institutions Group. So I've spent a disproportionate amount of my time working with and advising financial service brands. The short answer to your question, and the question was, of course technology is cool, but what about some of the things that on a conscious level might be less cool, like healthcare and financial service? Is cool important there too? My short answer is yes. As a category, financial service brands are decidedly less cool than as a category technology brands are. But within the category, there is a real opportunity to differentiate one brand from the other in terms of coolness. And it's such a low bar that you could really differentiate one brand versus another brand based on coolness. So I guess I'll end it there just to get an opportunity for one or two more questions.
Great. So one of the other ones that just came in was around social media. Can you please say something around the idea of social media promoting the perception of cool, and what are the key points of that, of using social media to promote it?
Yeah. So the question is the relationship between social media and coolness. This is one of the great chicken and egg questions. So if you're cool, does that generate a lot of social response, or does social response make you cool? I don't have a great answer for that. It's probably the most likely answer is both. But certainly a behavioral measurement of cool would be a lot of positive activity in the social blog. So what's that? The Gingham YouTube, the most watched YouTube of all time, that became incredibly cool because it amassed millions, if not hundreds of millions of followers who were talking about it and doing it. So I think they're highly related. I think that the caution is there is a certain amount of exclusivity to coolness, and when it becomes too ubiquitous, it stops being cool. So again, a dated example, but when everybody started wearing Abercrombie t-shirts, the cool kids moved on. So there needs to be a certain element of exclusivity and of secrecy to some cool brands.
Great. Well, Gary, we only have 3 minutes left, so do you have any recommendations for how people can get in touch with you if they have further questions or ones that were not answered today?
Sure. I would love to answer additional questions. Probably the easiest way to get in touch with me is by email, and I'll give you my secret email address, which is gary@buyologyinc.com. Buyology is spelled BUYOLOGYINC.com. And I would be delighted if you would reach out and if you have other questions. And of course, you can also contact us through the MITX people.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gary, for your time. Just as a reminder, I mentioned in the beginning we did record our webinar today, and we will send you the link to the recording so that you can access and listen to everything that you've heard again here today. And on behalf of MITX, we also invite you to attend our upcoming e-commerce summit, which will delve into similar topics in a much deeper way. We'll be discussing the evolving customer journey and how it is and has changed, and how things like behaviors and consumers are changing the purchasing process. That event is on February 1st, and more information can be found on our website at mitx.org. If I could hold a round of applause on a webinar like this, I certainly would. For Gary, thank you so much. Today's presentation was incredibly insightful.
Thank you, everybody.
And again,
and Jamie,
thank you.
Thank you for being such a skilled moderator.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us today. And with that, we're ending right on time at 2. Have a great afternoon, everyone.